thank you, everyone, for coming. For those that are here, for you that are watching, thank you for watching. And for those who are going to watch in the future, we thank you in advance. We like you to remember to make your purchasing decisions based on products and services that are available for sale. That said, I'm John Jenkins. I work in the Heroku product organization, and my focus is helping customers to be successful using Heroku products. And my colleague probably doesn't need introduction, but I'll let Julian say hello anyways.
Of course, my name is Julian Duque. I'm a principal developer advocate for Heroku. I'm in charge of creating content, videos, blog posts, demos, and all the cool stuff that you see pretty much on the campground and other events.
So Salesforce actually did us a great favor in terms of this presentation, in that on the main website in salesforce.com under news, they released this article and they said, well, the headline's actually not surprising. A bunch of companies want to do agent projects. But in particular, they said most of the leaders they talked to believed that they needed to nail integration for those AI projects to actually work. And of interest in that article also, they mentioned that typically in these organizations, they saw that 50% of code was actually available for reuse. So there's this opportunity to use APIs to get at information that companies already have. So I'm going to refer back to this article from time to time in this conversation. This is what we're going to talk about. I'm going to talk about API-driven development, and then going to talk about some Salesforce products that help you build APIs, and then I'm going to talk to you specifically about what you should do with your API specification so that it works well with Agentforce, and then we'll finish with a demo by Julian.
Yep.
So, yeah, I actually said this. I'll explain. I used to be a mobile developer, and at one point, I was working for a company that got acquired. And some guy came in from the company that acquired us, brought me in a room, pointed me at a whiteboard, and said, draw me a architecture diagram for a typical mobile project you do. So I smiled. I grabbed a whiteboard marker, and I drew a phone. I said, we make mobile apps, and if we need something that's not on the phone, there's usually an API for it. Anything else? I don't care. And yeah, that's cheeky, but it actually was true because I was working with a bunch of engineers, quality assurance engineers, developers, UX designers, artists, and we had built phone and tablet apps for a ton of really big companies, and we were really good at it. But we only did the stuff that was on the devices. If we needed to get at stuff that was not on the device, there was using an API that would give that to us. The stuff on the other side of the APIs, we just didn't spend any time looking at that. And really, I think that's okay because that's the point of what you get with doing API-driven development is you can divide up the work. You can have people who focus on consuming the APIs, and you can have people that focus on building the systems that send the information with the APIs. And the key to this is you need an API specification. An API specification is a document that defines what actions can I take, what do the inputs need to look like, and then what are the output formats of what I get back. And when you're working with Salesforce and Agentforce, you'll often be working with a particular standardized format called Open API Specification, or OAS. So what does it look like to do projects like this? Well, I can give you a practical example. At one point, I built the phone app for a major airline. And so I had a team, and we, actually, for you that came to this conference, if you flew, you very likely boarded a plane by showing a boarding pass on your phone. That's commonplace now. It was novel when we did it. So my team built the experience to show your reservations and show the boarding pass and all the various aspects of your travel, designed that experience. What we did not do was go dig around in the back-end systems of the airline and figure out how to look up reservations in their mainframe or find flight status or that kind of stuff, because that really just wasn't our job. What I did instead was I sat down with engineers from the airline. They knew how to find the reservations and that other information. I knew what I wanted to show. We just came up with an interface, an API specification. So then I could say, I want to make this screen, I need this information, and it's going to look, I'll send you this information, and you'll send information back to me in the agreed upon format. And so we did that. We agreed on the format. What they did for us next was really cool. They stood up systems that just sent us fake data in the format that we agreed upon. So we were able to actually start designing the screens before any of the stuff really worked. And the cool thing about this is at some point in the project, we're just working and they call us up and say, hey, the reservations you're getting are real. Our response, look at our phones, yep, shrug, get back to work, because there were no surprises there. It worked exactly the way the API specification said it would work. And what I want to tell you, which is really exciting, is I really like this way of developing, and you get this exact same experience if you're doing Agentforce development. You can be developing an agent and you need to get it some information that's not in your Salesforce system. You can just add an API action and it just works. You don't have to worry about the stuff on the other side of the API because it works like the specification says it does. And the reason why this works well is because of stuff that's existed in Salesforce for a while. External services. To create an external service on Salesforce, you have to start with an API specification. You create your external service with an API specification. This is what it does. It generates Apex for you. It writes the classes that have the code to access those services and defining what the objects look like that you send and what your responses look like. This is code you don't have to write, you don't have to maintain, you don't have to test. I love auto-generated code, but it's not just Apex. External services also work in flow, so you get a building block. You can be building with blocks and clicks and you want to call out to an API, you just add an action block and it just works. And with Agentforce, you want to access an API, you add an agent access, say you want API type, choose external services, the same external services show up for you to use in your agents. So let me talk to you about the other side, because at this point I've been talking about how great it is to be a consumer of APIs and not have to worry about the other side, but some of us do worry, right? Some of us, it is our responsibility to do that side, and I don't want to give you the impression that Salesforce has nothing to offer. We have, in fact, 2 different product lines that work very well for doing the services for APIs. Talk to you first about MuleSoft. MuleSoft bills itself as being a platform for integration, API management, and automation. I'm going to focus on these first 2. Actually, look at that first point. Remember the news article? Integration is key to the success of the agent projects, okay? Creating integrations on MuleSoft, you can do it with blocks and clicks, just like you're doing Flow on Salesforce. But MuleSoft Anypoint has a ton of connectors to connect to other systems. I mean, look at this list. There are so many systems that it already just knows inherently how to connect to. So what this means for you, doing an agent project, if you got a bunch of other systems you need to connect to, MuleSoft may have already solved the problem for you. So that's very important to think about. But also, in terms of the article and code available for reuse, sometimes that means that there are actually already APIs out there in an organization. You just need to organize how you're getting to them so that your agent project can be successful. Well, MuleSoft has a product for that. It's called Flex Gateway, and that's the point. You can define how your routes look. When I hit this route, go to this API. You get this route, you go to this API. That's what API management can look like. And when you're managing APIs with MuleSoft Anypoint, you can apply policies to them. Things like API keys or rate limiting, or you can even write custom policies. And just with a click, you can say for this route, I'm going to control it with these policies. It's very flexible. Also, when you're managing APIs with MuleSoft, you're required to have an API spec, which is actually great because you need the API spec also for Agentforce and Salesforce. What this means is if you're doing things the way MuleSoft is telling you to do it, it's just going to work with the Salesforce stuff too. So that's really cool. And they have an API editor built in, so that ensures that when you're writing stuff, your APIs are going to work with Agentforce. And when you write an API specification in MuleSoft, it shows up in Anypoint Exchange. You tag which ones you want to be in Salesforce. And then when you connect your MuleSoft Anypoint with your Salesforce org, you go and set up under API catalog, and those APIs that are in MuleSoft, they show up there. You can activate them and use them in your agent actions. Then there's Heroku. Heroku bills itself as being a platform for building, deploying, and scaling apps. In this case, you'd be right, in this circumstance, it would be API apps. To create API apps and sit in Heroku, that's writing code. And we have 9 supported language runtimes. But when I say language runtimes, I don't want you to just think of the language. I mean, when I say you can write Node.js, I'm not just saying you can write JavaScript. I'm also saying you have thousands and thousands of packages available to you using NPM. And that's the same. Java gives you access to a ton of Java libraries, Python, a bunch of Python libraries, .NET, a ton of .NET libraries. All those can be brought to bear on writing your software. Some of those are going to be conveniences to help you write API servers. And also, again, in terms of the code reuse in an organization, sometimes code reuse looks like you have some proprietary Java libraries or proprietary Python libraries that your company has written. Well, you can run those. We've got the runtimes. And also, Heroku has a notion of add-ons, including data storage. And to add these into your org, it's just, into your Heroku app, it's just a few clicks. And we've got Postgres, key value store, which is compatible with Redis, Kafka, and when you get that added into your app, it adds the environment variables and it just inherently knows how to talk to it. So it's very, very productive for building. So that's building the app, but once you've built an app, how do you get it running in the cloud? Well, deployment on Heroku is legendary. You can ask anybody who's done it before, like, how simple is it? Okay, Julian, if you're written your app and you need to deploy it to Heroku, like, what do you do?
One command, I do git push Heroku main,
yep.
Or with one click, I just connect my GitHub to the Heroku dashboard, click, and that's it.
Yeah, it's really that simple. It's the same tools that any developer is using many times a day to just save their source-to-source control. But in this case, you're sending your source project to Heroku, and Heroku looks at it and goes, oh, look, that's a Java app, or that's a Python app. I know how to build that. Grabs the build pack, builds your code, grabs the dependencies, sticks it in a runtime, and it runs it in our infrastructure and gives you a URL to access it. It's really that easy. And now, newly, as of this week, we also have a Visual Studio Code plugin. Visual Studio Code is one of the most popular environments to write code in, and now there's an extension in for Heroku where you can have a Heroku project open and it goes, oh, that's a Heroku project. You want to deploy it? Mash the button, give it a name, tell it where you want to go, press deploy, done. So getting your code running in the cloud, great. Once it's running, Heroku's really focused on letting you be productive as a developer and trying to take away having to manage the details of keeping your stuff running. But we understand that you're going to want to configure some things, so we try to abstract and make that as easy to manage as possible. Example, if you wanted to have more or less compute to manage your workload, that could be a lot of parameters, but we abstract that into blocks we call dynos, so you can basically just pick from a list of more or less compute power, select that, run it, and you're running with more compute power. Or if you needed to run on more instances, it's just a single CLI command or a slider, and then all of a sudden you're running on multiple instances. Getting your Heroku apps into into Salesforce, that's also really simple. We have a product and pilot called AppLink, and it's just a few CLI commands, and that'll connect your app to a Salesforce org, and with an API spec, it'll pull it in and create the external services and all the plumbing, and it even creates a secure connection from Salesforce to the app and from the app to Salesforce. All that, and then your app shows up in API catalog and also for use as an API action when you're building an agent. All right, now notice, I've shown you this exact same screen 3 times in a row. I hope you noticed that. And this illustrates my point. It doesn't matter, external services, MuleSoft, Heroku, it's the same experience. And this means you really do get this development, this way of development that I've been promoting, which is you can be developing Agentforce, you need to grab an API, you grab the API, create an action, and it works. You don't have to worry about the fact of whether it was created with MuleSoft or Heroku or whatever. It just, from your point of view, it just works the same, and that's very productive. Interestingly, you can actually use MuleSoft and Heroku together in some instances. For example, you might already use MuleSoft and then you want to add some Heroku APIs, or you might have multiple clients that need to access some APIs you have in Heroku. Let me unpack that second one for you. Say you had a bunch of APIs written in Heroku. If you needed to connect them to Agentforce only, we already told you, app link, that's the easy way to do it, right? But what if you also needed to connect it to a bunch of other systems, or you might have consumer web or mobile apps, right? Well, there's a pattern you can use. Let me show you. Heroku has a concept called a private space. When you use a private space in Heroku, you have an option to deploy your apps as internal only to that private space. So you could deploy these API apps as internal only. When you do that, they can only be accessed by other apps that are within the same private space. So if you have these things outside the private space, like Agentforce or the mobile, they can't see those, but you can get access to them. You just add one more app to the private space, a Flex Gateway. Yes, you can actually run MuleSoft Flex Gateway as a Heroku app, which means that then you get all of the convenience of how you deploy and how you scale that you get for any other Heroku app, but with this Flex Gateway. But you deploy it, in this case, marking the Flex Gateway as not internal only. It's in the private space, so it can actually see those API apps, but also, since it's not marked as internal only, the things outside the private space can actually see it. What's just happened is that Flex Gateway becomes the only route to get from those outside applications to those Heroku APIs. In other words, you are managing the Heroku APIs with MuleSoft Anypoint. And I told you about all the advantages you get of managing APIs with MuleSoft Anypoint. You've got that now, including the API becomes available to show up an API catalog and as an agent action. Now, interestingly, that agent action shows up, it would show up as a MuleSoft API because that's how it's visible to the Agentforce setup. It actually is Heroku APIs, but they're being exposed as MuleSoft. But as I already told you, that doesn't matter. From the point of the Agentforce developer, they work the same. So this is actually a really cool pattern, and it was developed, co-developed by Heroku and MuleSoft product and engineering. There's a blog post about it, co-written by MuleSoft and Heroku. Julian's a co-author of that blog post. We talked about this at Dreamforce last year, MuleSoft and Heroku together. I presented it along with a product manager from MuleSoft. So this is a great pattern. You can be very productive with it. So before we get to the demo, got one more point I want to hit, which is that it's important how you write your API specifications when you are working with Agentforce. And I liken it to the reasons why we comment code. It's an analogy. I'll tell you. You write. Why do we comment code? It's for people, and or it can be for machines. So think about this. You write a brilliant hunk of code. Do you remember every single decision you made a day later, a week later, month later, year later? No, you don't. And that's why, like forever, there's been the way you can write code and have comments, and you leave little notes to yourself and say, so you can look at it and go, oh yeah, I remember now why I did it that way. But comments aren't just for you. I mean, think about the article again about code reuse in an organization. Someone else might be going and trying to use your code, and it's awfully nice if you left them some hints about how it's going to work. Honestly, I remember people from a long time ago that the reason why I liked to work with them was because they commented their code well, so it was just easier to use their stuff with my stuff. But comments aren't just for people. Sometimes it can be for machines. Let me show you. What is this? This is JavaDoc. JavaDoc works like this. You write comments in a particular format, in particular places in your code, and then a system can come through later and use those to automatically generate documentation for you. So sometimes when you code, the comments, the way you do your comments, that can enable automated systems to do their work, okay? So, but that's an analogy. What I really wanted to talk to you about is description fields. Here's something you should be familiar with, creating an object in Salesforce. there's a description field right there, but that's optional. So sure, your objects will work just fine, but for the people coming after you, they'd really appreciate it if you had descriptions filled in for your objects and fields so they know what you were trying to do. Likewise, API specifications have description fields, but they are optional. So sure, you can take this API spec with no descriptions and create an external service with it. It'll work, but check this out. If you create an API specification and fill in the descriptions, watch what happens when I pull it into an Agentforce action. It automatically populates the instructions for the Agentforce action. So this is the big idea, okay? What you don't want is for someone building Agentforce, they're like, okay, I'm building my agent, I want to grab an API and do my work, and they get to this screen and the instructions are blank. Because what happens then? Then they have to go and find the API spec and read it and try to figure out, like, how is this supposed to work? How do I tell the agent to use this? That's not how this should work. What should happen is the people making the API specification, listen to this carefully. You write the descriptions in your API specification as if you were giving instructions to an agent, because if you do that, it auto-populates these instructions, and then you get this development experience which I've been promoting, which is, I'm an Agentforce developer, I need to use an API, I grab it, it just populates correctly and just works. I don't have to worry about how that works on the API side. I can just be productive. So with that, I'm going to let Julian show you practically how that can look with a demo.
Of course, thank you very much, Jonathan, for all that information. And pretty much what I'm going to do is go through everything that Jonathan just covered on a practical case. I'm going to be showing you an application that we are exposing on Heroku. We are using MuleSoft. We are exposing an API specification and integrated it with Agentforce. Let me go to the app. So here we have a web application for a fictitious solar energy company called Luminar Solar, where it's built using a three-tier architecture. We have an API application, which is the one that connects to the database, has all the backend information, and we have an UI application built with React.js that consumes that API. So my first application that becomes the consumer of that API is just the interface. And this could also be like a mobile application as well. This API is deployed on a private space and is marked as an internal application. So the external world cannot access this API. Only applications that are deployed within the same private space are able to access this information. How are we exposing this API to the world and to my web application? Through the Flex Gateway. We deploy the Flex Gateway into Heroku. We are managing all the scalability of that Flex Gateway and our API on Heroku. And then we are letting any point to manage the API, to do the rest, to manage policies, to manage authentication, SLAs, etc. And since we are going to have another consumer for this API, in this case, either a Flow or Agentforce, we are exposing this API to Salesforce using the API catalog, right? So now let's go and take a look at how this private space looks like on an Heroku dashboard. Here I am on Heroku. I'm on a private space that is located on the Oregon data center, which is going to be the closest to where we are right now. And we have three different applications deployed here. We have the Luminar Solar API internal, which is the one that cannot be accessed outside. We have another one that is external, so I can show you the difference between an internal and an external application. And we have the Flex Gateway. If I open this external application, it is running on a private space, but if I go and open this application, it resolves to a DNS URL, and I can access. So this is open to the world. And I have access to the full documentation of the API because I'm using the API specification. and a plugin that can read that the specification and give me the documentation of that API. But now if I go to the internal application, and you see the difference here on Heroku, it says that these can only be accessed within the private space, and I try to open it, this is not going to resolve to anything. I cannot access this because I am not within the same network. I will need to either establish a VPN connection and do some stuff if I want to get access to it. So what we did to expose this internal API was to deploy the Flex Gateway from MuleSoft Anypoint to Heroku. This is a Docker image. On Heroku, you can deploy both like a application built with the different runtimes that Jonathan said, or you can also deploy a Docker container. So this is a Docker container that has the Flex Gateway running. We registered this Flex Gateway within MuleSoft on the runtime manager, and we did all the connection of the Flex Gateway and the API that we are running internally on Heroku. If I open the Flex Gateway, I should get access to the internal API. So now I'm opening directly the URL of the gateway, but I'm getting into the API that I expose. And I have full control of this API from MuleSoft. So now let's go and take a look at the MuleSoft side of things. Here, I am on Anypoint. I'm on the runtime manager, where we register the different Flex Gateways. And we have this that is running on Heroku. If I click on it, I see that my Flex Gateway is running on 4 instances, or 4 dynos. So I, on Heroku, scale this application to run on 4 different compute environments to have more scalability. Let's say tomorrow is Black Friday, we are going to get a lot of traffic, and we are expecting a huge increase. We can either activate auto scalability on Heroku with just 1 click, or scale manually to have a little bit more control. If I go back to the Flex Gateway app, click on resources, you see that this is running on 4 dynos. And vertically, I'm running on a private M dyno, which has like 2.5 gigabytes of RAM, and it has like certain amount of CPU and compute. If we want to go higher, I can just, as Jonathan said, just slide on the URL, and now I'm going to be running on 6 different dynos, 6 different instances. So I will have more capacity to attend all the traffic that is coming in. This is going to take a little bit of time to register here, because it will run a new Docker image on Heroku, and then it will notify the change here. But what I want to show you is now the API. We have the gateway running. Now we need to specify and define an API here. First and foremost, what we need to do is create an API specification on MuleSoft. So this is the API specification that defines what Luminar Solar created. And I didn't create this manually. I did it using code by commenting my code. I commented my API routes using schemas, and automatically the framework that I'm using on Node.js created the specification for me. If you go to that documentation side that I showed you before, you see that I have direct access to that generated API specification. If you are working with frameworks like FastAPI from Python or Spring from Java, they do the same thing. They auto-generate the specification for you. This is why we are talking about API-driven development here. And this is also a good place to get documentation for your API. I'm specifying, OK, this is the path of the endpoint that I'm going to hit, the description, an example of the input and output of this API, so a developer knows how to use this API, but most importantly, a machine or a system based out of this specification knows how to interact with it. After having the specification on MuleSoft, I publish this on Exchange from the code builder. And then, now we see that we have the 6 instances, nice. And then we can go to the API section on any point and see that we have the API here. This is the API that I already published and registered. And if we see the details, I am connecting this API to the Flex Gateway, and I'm specifying pretty much the consumer endpoint, which is the public URL, and the upstream, which is the internal URL. So Flex Gateway can access this internal URL, and is exposing everything on this consumer endpoint. And finally, I need to tag this API as an agent action, an API catalog, if I want to use it in Salesforce. So now, anybody can use my API. Now let's go to Salesforce and see how can we bring this API in. From Salesforce, if we go to the API catalog, I previously set up the connection between Salesforce and MuleSoft, and it appeared that my API is available here. By default, it's going to be inactive because I need to select the different methods that I want to make available to my org. If I open the Luminaire API here, I have the different operations that I can expose to a flow or execute from an Apex class or as an agent action. And I can show you, I have some that are properly documented and some others that doesn't have any documentation. If I try to open these ones that doesn't have documentation on Agentforce, I will need to fill out the instructions fields manually. And now that I have these things here, I can go to Agentforce, go and create a new agent action, select the type of action, in this case, API, and it gives me different options. Remember, even though we are running on Heroku the implementation, we are exposing through MuleSoft, so my services are going to be available on MuleSoft. Now I see the different actions here. These are the ones that I'm exposing. And let's say I want to implement an action for get a product information by ID. I click on that action that I'm exposing from my API, go next, and now it gives me what are the inputs, which is the ID that I'm going to pass to get the product information, and the outputs that this API has. I just need to finish this configuration and make this action available on my agent and start calling it from it. And that's how you do it. That's how you expose APIs, either from Heroku or from MuleSoft, and use them on Salesforce. And I think that was pretty much what I wanted to show on the demo. We can continue with the presentation to have some time for a Q&A.
Yeah.
Perfect. So thank you very much for joining us in this session. We are going to enter on a Q&A, and also remember that feedback is a gift. So if you want to leave us some feedback to let us know what you want to see on our upcoming presentations. And thank you very much, and let's go and listen to your questions right now. Can you use the microphone here so we all can hear the question? Thank you.
Thank you so much.
The question is, if I have a third-party API, I have built an API in a Spring Boot or it's running on a Java engine, and I want to expose that to the agent. Can I do it? Do I require a Flex Gateway of MuleSoft, or I can directly expose that API, which is running on the Spring Boot or Java, Apache, Camel, and expose it in the API catalog of Salesforce?
So it depends where it is deployed. Let's say you have deployed in your own infrastructure, and you want to bring it into Salesforce. You can do directly through external services, for example. What you need to do on external services is a more manual approach. You will need to create an external and named credential to specify the authentication method between Salesforce and your API. Then you need to register a external service. So you will need to do that manually. Then you will need to upload the API specification, select the methods that you want to expose, and test that everything works. It's a little bit more manual, but it's the same process. You are going to see the actions the same. At the end, all of those three different categories are external services. But MuleSoft and Heroku provides you tools to automate that import of the API specification and set up the authentication between the two systems.
But then we have to specify the agent information, the topic and the agent information in the API specification.
If the API specification is properly described with the comments, descriptions, you don't have to.
Okay.
Otherwise, you can just do it without a problem.
Okay. Thank you.
So, we have any other question here? Awesome, I think that's it. Thank you very much. Heroku has a huge presence at TDX. We have more sessions going on. We have 3 different demo booths at the campground. We are showing more about this pattern, how to integrate Heroku with MuleSoft, how to integrate Heroku directly with Agentforce, with AppLink, how to integrate Heroku with the Slack, and some more amazing sessions. Later today, we have a workshop to show you how to build a Slack application on Heroku. And tomorrow, all of these great sessions. Go to Agenda Builder, reserve those, and see you then. Thank you so much.
Thank you.